Started.
All right. Well, we are delighted that everyone's joining us today. Continue to say hi in the chat. Tell us where you're from. But also, as Michelle is saying, we want you to this to be interactive. So, questions that come up, big aha moments, anything you want to share in the chat. And we'll be monitoring that and answering questions as we go. And we want everyone to just feel at home and relaxed here. Michelle and I were just talking about, both of us this morning kind of having some technology issues and then dogs barking and all of those things. So we understand that. And that's just part of our virtual world. And we're making it all work. But I am Kelly Kelly. I'm the founder and I am the CEO of Hand to Hold. And we are absolutely delighted to have Michele Rosenthal with us today, part of a three-part trauma recovery series. She will be speaking at our conference November 3rd through the 5th. We'll talk about that some more today too, but if you have not already registered to be a part of the NICU Community Conference, November 3rd through 5th, a virtual conference for NICU parents and professionals, as well as a third session following the conference. So today is just our first part in this three-part series. And Michele is one of our favorite people in talking about trauma. If you're a NICU parent, more than likely you experienced some kind of trauma, traumatic birth, traumatic NICU stay, maybe even the loss of a baby. So we're all coming at this a little different from our own individual experiences, but trying to live full lives after trauma. But if we haven't paused and gone through the recovery, it can hinder us for many years, ongoing effects for so many years. And I'm the first to say, I didn't do that hard work for a really long time. And I see the long term consequences of not pausing and doing that work earlier. And it is ongoing. I find that I need a little tune up from here to there. And Michele, I'm sure you'll agree. And we'll learn more about that. But living life after trauma fully is what we all want for ourselves and for all of you that are joining us today. And Michele is a trauma survivor as well. So she's coming to this from a personal and professional perspective. So your life after trauma begins today. And Michele is going to guide us through interactive. We want it to be interactive environment designed for education, encouragement, and empowerment. We want to leave empowered, not only for ourselves, but I see a lot of people on here who work with and support other NICU families, and we want you to be empowered so you can help them too. We invite you to be an active participant and comment in the comment section, ask questions. If at any time today that you feel uncomfortable being on screen, if this is bringing up some emotions and things for you, feel free to turn off your camera. That is totally okay, or step away if you need to. We're going to record this session today. So if you want to come back and watch it later when you're feeling that it's a more appropriate time, that is fine too. In the breakout sessions, those will not be recorded. We want you to feel safe and comfortable in that environment and be able to share. So don't worry about that. And any contact information, your name, and all those personal things will not be showing up. So we just want you to feel comfortable in sharing your personal stories and asking questions today. Michele, again, just an absolute honor to have you here with us today. I am so excited. I want to kick it over to you so we can get the most out of this hour today. Welcome and thank you. We really appreciate you leading us through this first track of our three-part series.
Kelly, thank you so much. And thank you so much to Crystal for helping to organize this in such a tremendous behind the scenes kind of way. And Kelly, you and I have known each other for a really long time. And we met a very long time ago in the trauma space. And I just so admire what you're doing, how you are taking what your experience was and moving through it in a way that allows so many other people to find a community. And that's so close to my own heart. And I just want to build on something that you said before I'm going to change our screen and share my screen with you all so that you can see the slides and sort of digest some of what we're saying. But I wanted to just underscore, Kelly, what you said. I don't think most of us, I would say like 99% of us, go through trauma and we do not go for help right away. That is not the model socially or culturally. And it's definitely not the model of the brain, because the brain gets so acutely impacted by trauma that a lot of times it takes at least 30 days just to be able to sort of reconnect to any kind of life that feels grounded, centered, whole, or present. And for many people, it takes more than 30 days. And I won't have time to go into it today, but I'll just drop this little neuroscience truth bomb on you. The part of the brain that really experiences trauma is the reptilian part, your survival oriented brain, which is the oldest part of your brain, and the limbic system, which is the middle of your brain. Now, those two parts of your brain do not have access to language. This is really important. It's only the third youngest part of your brain, the cortex, that actually has access to language. And so during a trauma, and this will just kick us off because this is where we're headed, it's really important to understand that during a trauma, you are intensely in survival mode and intensely in emotional mode. And the part of your brain that has thought and language goes offline because it's not a part of the survival system. So it's very normal to come out of a trauma and not even have words to describe what you've experienced or how you're feeling. And I think that has a lot to do also with why we don't go for help, because we can't even start to put language to what's going on, what's happened, what's happening, and what's continuing. So just sort of throwing that out there for anybody who feels like, I didn't go quick enough. I would never say that. I would say you went at exactly the right time. And we all get to that moment. And we all know when we've gotten there.
Well, let me just, I think, I certainly want to let you run with this, but I want to underscore that I did go, but then when the work got hard, I'd stop. Yeah. And so it took a really long time. And I know we have to do that and process it and take our time to go through that healing. But I do think, when the going got tough, I said, I'm out. And so it really, I encourage anyone that has put the brakes on to do the hard work and go through the really deep, dark, difficult time with the right therapist. I think that's really important too. You have to have the right therapist that you trust and connect with and can do that with. But don't put off that hard work in order to get to that full recovery stage. So with that, I'll let you take us. Are you able to share your screen?
I am. And that's such a juicy thing that I won't divert us into another conversation, but I think there's room for another track just to have a conversation about when do you go for help. So Crystal, if you could just sort of note that for some future date, because I think you're right. A lot of us drop out when we get to the hard work. And I think there's value in dropping out, actually. I won't go any further than that right now, but it's an interesting conversation to have for sure. So, okay, I am going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Whoops, there we go. And I'm going to move this, and here we go. So let's all dive in and welcome to Your Life After Trauma Starts Today. And the reason that I gave it that name is because, let's get rid of this in the middle of the screen. The reason I gave it that name is because everything that's come up until today, that's yesterday. And we all know the best thing about the past is that it's over. The best thing about the future is that it's coming. And you, in this moment, are right in between. And so at any moment, trauma, recovery, and your life after trauma, it starts in the moment you decide I'm present today. So that's really what this presentation is about. So I want you to get ready. I want you to note the details that really, really resonate with you, because there's a lot of information coming up, and I will make the slides available to anyone who wants them. I'll talk about that at the end. I'll give you my email address, and if you just shoot me an email that says slides in the subject, I'll just send you these so you can have them and look them over at your leisure. But make sure you list your questions so that we can have a really juicy Q&A at the end, and also outline the data that matters to you, because it's in those hard psychological moments, leaning on the data can make things a lot easier, and you'll see why as we move through this. So today's agenda, we're going to really define trauma and PTSD, so you get a baseline definition of what trauma actually is, which is super important. It sort of levels the playing field. And then I'm going to share with you a PTSD self-test. So it'll be a sort of blind pop quiz. I'm going to read you the questions. You're just going to note down the answers and just allow all of that information to sort of settle over you. We're going to do healing tips and action steps, plus a live Q&A, and in between, 2 breakouts so that you can actually voice your experience, connect with others, and share what you're learning in terms of how it applies to you. So quick background, I am, as Kelly said, a trauma survivor. I struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for almost 30 years, 24 of those years undiagnosed. I just thought I was crazy and thought, well, just be the best crazy you can be. And then eventually I finally got the right diagnosis, found that right person to work with, and launched a recovery process that I call a healing rampage, affectionately. I call it that because it was not easy, it was not soft, it was not delicate, and it was not pretty. But by the time I came out the other side, I had a mission to make sure others healed faster than I did. And I've been very fortunate to share my mission all over the media through multiple books, interviews, speaking across the country, and being covered from different angles. I use dance as a very large part of my recovery, and Women's Day did a beautiful spread all about that. Fun little fact, because you never know where your recovery is leading you. I started to dance just because I needed to reconnect with the present moment in my body, and it led me into teaching, and it led me into falling in love with my dance instructors. So you just never know where trauma recovery is going to take you, even though it is the hardest and probably the scariest thing you might ever step into after your original trauma. So, okay. Trauma recovery starts with education. I've written 3 books about trauma and recovery. Kira, thank you so much for posting in the chat. Kira and I met a long time ago, and she read Before the World Intruded, which is this book here. It was my first. It's a memoir of trauma and recovery, and it's all about really what happens when we don't get into recovery quickly enough, and when we pull out of it, how do we come back courageously and triumphantly. And I don't know if you all remember Sporty Spice. There have been different celebrities who've picked up some of my books. This is a picture of Sporty with my 3rd book, Heal Your PTSD. So what we're really talking about today is fear. And fear is very general, right? It applies in so many different ways, and what causes you to feel fear versus somebody else can be totally different. You all know that 2 people can be in the same event and yet have 2 totally different experiences. One person may be terrified, another person may be just so happy to be alive. I have a client who was in a horrible car wreck, totally fine, everybody walked away, but her husband will not get back in the car because he's so terrified of what had happened and what could have come out of it. And she is just so happy to be alive. She's behind the wheel and driving all over the place. So fear is very personal, which means that trauma is also very personal. Now, when you look at all of these famous personalities and realize each of them has their own personal story of what caused them to feel fear and ultimately PTSD. And you don't think of them in their success, in their limelight, as being PTSD survivors. But PTSD is not just a famous face, and it's not just anonymous. Trauma is not just a person who knows the whole world or a person who doesn't know anyone. It's each one of us individually. So let's really get into what trauma is. And I'm going to give you a very simple baseline definition. I want you to write this down. I want you to share it with everyone you know, because too many people do not realize the basic essential of trauma and how it happens. And it's this: trauma is any experience that feels less than good. Now, when you start with that baseline definition, which was given to me by a psychologist who is the founder of The Refuge, a healing place. It's a fabulous trauma recovery center, actually right here in Florida. And Judy Crane said to me when I was interviewing her on my podcast, The basic definition of trauma is any experience that feels less than good. When you think about that, we are all trauma survivors pretty much the day we're born. Lots of experiences don't feel good. So we're leveling the playing field. And I think that's really important because so often we judge ourselves according to other people. Like, my trauma is not as bad as their trauma, so mine must not be important, or their trauma is not as bad, so my trauma is more important. And to stay away from that and to just get grounded in the truth of trauma and your own truth as a trauma survivor, we start here. Any experience that feels less than good, which is also any experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. Now, if you just think back to your own experience in the NICU, I'm sure you can identify more than one moment that was an experience that felt less than good, or a moment that overwhelmed your ability to cope. And in that space, then, we wind up with the 4 different ways that trauma impacts everyone. And this is a very important point, whether your trauma is physical in nature, emotional, mental, or spiritual. Trauma affects all 4 realms concurrently all the time. So for example, a domestic violence survivor who might have a very physical trauma experience still is going to have emotional, mental, and spiritual disruption. And someone who has an emotional trauma or a mental trauma that does not involve the physical is still going to have a physical disruption, because all trauma is all 4 realms. And we all know, you already understand, that the mind and the body are connected. So an enormous stress on the mind that overwhelms its ability to cope is going to impact the body in significant ways and cause trauma to the body. So if your body has become dysregulated, or it has aches or pains or other issues that you didn't have before, it most definitely can be trauma related. I love this little scientific tidbit. So on my podcast, I used to interview all of these trauma experts and also neuroscientists, neuropsychologists. So I was always diving into the science of trauma. And one of the neuroscientists that I interviewed said the mind is capable of producing 50% more stress than the body can handle. And I thought that was so interesting, because when you think about that, when the body overflows with the stress of the mind, what does it do? Well, it breaks down and it starts to send you messages that you need to receive. But oftentimes we're so busy coping with the trauma, we ignore the messages of the body. And if there's anything that you walk away from today, I hope one of the things is to listen to the messages of your body, because they are equally important after trauma as the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual messages that you're getting that may seem more connected to you than a physical symptom or signal, but the physical is equally important here. So signs of trauma, you all already will know this. I put this information in so that we can give everything context and you can start to see it all together. So phase 1, acute stress, 30 days. It takes the mind often 30 days to be able to re-regulate after trauma. So that means there can be anxiety, panic, behavioral disturbances, mood swings, sleep disturbances, different ways and styles of eating. Some people eat more, some people eat less, hyperarousal, avoidance. All of these things are acute stress and are totally normal. So if anyone in the first 30 days says to you, come on, you've got to pull yourself together, not true. You know, your mind needs 30 days sometimes to really be able to understand you are in the middle of, and you have already made a break with the past. Things are never going to be the same. You cannot go back to who you were. And these first 30 days are going to be rough potentially, and they are valuable in terms of self-care and giving yourself permission to experience any of the symptoms or the signs or the side effects on this slide or here. After 30 days, if you have any of these 5 categories of symptoms that start to really interrupt your ability to function socially, professionally, personally, that's when we start thinking about PTSD. And PTSD technically is when any of these 5 symptoms, and we all experience them in different ways, but when these 5 symptoms last for more than 30 days and become disruptive in how a life is being led. So, all right. I have a tendency to want to pause and dive into the chat here and see questions, but I'm going to hold off. But please, please know that as you think about this, where we're headed is, how does this apply to you? And maybe that has to do with your questions. And at this point right now, you can be thinking, well, do I have issues with being re-exposed to things that really remind me of that experience? Or do I keep having the same looping thought over and over and over, or more than one thought? Do I always feel like I'm tensed up and ready for the next bad thing to happen? These are all just, it's a good time to sort of check in with yourself and see what's going on for me. I just want to quickly position this. This is PTSD by the numbers. And I think it's just important, you know, the media has gotten better at really examining and bringing to the forefront mental health issues, especially since the pandemic. But when you look at these details, $42.3 billion is the estimated annual cost to society of anxiety disorders. And that was before the pandemic. And post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder. Now, I'm not saying you all have that. I'm just saying that's if you just start with trauma and then things expand before you reclaim control, you end up in this pool, which is totally feasibly healable. It's just good to know sort of where you are on the spectrum. So PTSD statistics, and I like these because it sort of starts to position, you're not alone, you're not weird, strange, abnormal, or crazy. I have a lot of clients who will sit in my office and say, well, I know this sounds ridiculous, or I know this sounds insane. It's not. Everything that you're thinking, everything that you're feeling, somebody else has felt that, and they're in these statistics. They're in your NICU community, and they're in the rest of the world as well. Because the most interesting thing that I've learned from all these years working in this industry, and the thing that surprised me the most, is that we all have different traumas, and we are unique in our trauma experience. But in our post-trauma experience, we are completely universal. The signs, the symptoms, the side effects are all the same. And in our healing, we are again completely unique. So what works for one person may or may not work for another person, but there are so many opportunities for healing that it is possible to find your personal customized path. So just to bring a little levity in here, when all of a sudden you start to lose your stripes because what was familiar is no longer familiar, you can start thinking about and looking at, is this stress? Is what's going on for me something that's ongoing? Can I manage it? Can I resolve it? Or do I need some help? And the first step to needing help is to start thinking about your own experience. So what I want to do right now, and Crystal, I'm going to ask you for help in this, is to break us out just for a short, maybe 8 or 10 minutes breakout with 3 to 4 people in a group, just to, you've had a quick nosedive into what does trauma look like. So you can start thinking about, how is this affecting me? Is it physical? Is it emotional? Is it spiritual? Is it mental? What symptoms am I having? Am I having nightmares? Am I having intrusive thoughts? Am I having recurring thoughts that I can't stop? What are you noticing just from what we've already gone over applies to you? And what have you learned so far? So, Crystal, do you want to create the breakout rooms, or do you want me? I think you need to do it.
Yes, I have them all set. So when you are ready, I'm just adding, we're having one more person join us right now. So I'm going to make sure that they are set in a breakout room, and I think we're ready to go. So when you're ready, we can go.
All right, so here's my tip. In these breakout rooms, talk about what signs, symptoms, or side effects you notice apply to you or to someone you love, because maybe you're not the primary person, maybe you're here as a support person. So identify what signs and symptoms and side effects you've already recognized or a part of your experience, and then offer one takeaway that you've heard so far that started you thinking something or educated you about something that you think may be helpful. And then we'll just take maybe 2 minutes for each person to share. So let's do this in about 8 or 9 minutes, Crystal. So when you get into your groups, choose somebody who's the timekeeper. You can do that the person with the shortest hair. You can do that the person with the longest hair. However you want to decide who the timekeeper is. Find somebody who keeps the time so that you know each person has 2 minutes to share, and then we'll all come back. Now, caveat, if you all decide you just want to have a free-for-all conversation because it works better for your flow, that's fine too. I just sort of want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to be heard. So I'll give you those 2 options for how to do it. Crystal, let's go. I'm so tempted to ask everyone, what did you share? What did you think? But in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so that we continue on with the presentation and we stay on time. So now you've had a chance to sort of take some of what you've already been hearing and seeing and feeling and sort of put some context around it, share it with someone else. We were just talking in our breakout session at the very end of the importance of connection after trauma and how much of a difference that can make. And it's one of the reasons I love what Hand to Hold really stands for. And this whole community coming together to create a space that's safe, that's action oriented, that's solution oriented, and that is all about moving forward as best you can, because for everyone that's going to be different. So let's dive in now. And I want to tell you all about the PTSD self-test, which originally I was thinking, let me just pop in the chat here. Crystal, do you have some insights here on, do we have a lot of questions to answer? I need to sort of know where I am time-wise so that I keep us on track, and I pay attention to the time for everyone because I know everyone's time is valuable.
Right. I've only seen one really come through. I just want to commend our participants because they have been answering questions for each other, and they've been so great in the chat. We do have one when we're kind of talking about language, and they asked if you could list the first 2 parts of the brain that don't hear language.
Yes, yes. So in Dr. McLean put together what is a very remedial view of the brain. It's called the Triune brain model. I love it. It's not the most updated model of the brain these days, but for our purposes, it simplifies a very complex system. So in the very beginning, there was the reptilian brain, and that's at the back, the base of your brain stem. It's your survival response. So the reptilian brain is really just about making sure you survive. It identifies threat and it responds to it. That's all that it does. It has no language whatsoever. It changes your body chemistry and it activates your fight, flight, or freeze response. The midbrain was the next part of the brain that developed, evolutionarily speaking. That's where your limbic system is housed. That is your emotional center. So what happens during a trauma is your reptilian brain alerts you to the trauma, activates sympathetic mode, which is your fight, flight, or freeze mode. And your limbic brain is the emotional presence that you have during that moment, or moments, or days, or weeks. So every emotion that you have is coming from that mid center of the brain. So you can think of it, it's the reptilian part, it's the mammalian, is the center of the brain, that's the limbic system. And then surrounding all of that is the neo-mammalian, also known as the neocortex, which is the youngest part of your brain, the last to have been developed. And that is your executive thinking part of your brain. That's the part that has access to language. But during a trauma, all non-essential body systems go offline. So you don't need to think during a trauma. If you were thinking, if you think about our caveman ancestors, if there's a saber-toothed tiger coming and you stand to think about, well, what does this mean? Does he look friendly? Does he look that bad? Does it look like I could probably, fight back? If you had that whole conversation with yourself, you'd be dead. So the brain shuts off that thinking part. It doesn't want to have a debate or any kind of critical analysis. It wants you up in the tree, right? It wants you to survive. And so it shuts down that thought process. If you've ever been in the middle of a trauma and just thought like, I can't even think, that's why your body shuts down what's not necessary. During a trauma, for example, your digestion shuts down, your reproductive system shuts down, all of your resources go to your extremities so you can literally fight, flight, or freeze. So that's the triune brain model, is those three aspects of the brain: the reptilian, the mammalian, and the neo-mammalian. And it's only the neo-mammalian that has access to language. So sometimes during and after trauma, those parts of the brain, they don't talk to each other. They get a little bit discombobulated, or a lot discombobulated. I know after my trauma, which was medical, when I got out of the hospital, I couldn't talk about what had happened to me. There was just no way. Partly that was because I was so terrified and overwhelmed by what I had survived, which included a near-death experience. And partly just because there just weren't words to describe that kind of pain, that kind of terror. So it can take time for the brain to sort of get all the pieces back online. So I don't know, that might have been longer explanation than you all intended, but I love the science and being able to see the big picture. So I hope that helped and was useful.
And we do have another one that asked about, what do you mean by alterations?
Oh, alterations. So we're talking about symptoms, right? So it may be like you've always been someone who eats 3 meals a day because your body's naturally hungry 3 times a day. But then after a trauma, maybe you get so depressed and lethargic and despondent that maybe you don't even eat 1 time a day. Maybe you nibble on some crackers and that's it. There's an alteration in your own processes. That's one example. We can talk about alterations in terms of mood swings. So you may have always been, well, I'm a very up person, right? But then trauma happens and like all the light went out of me. There was nothing. I was very flatlined emotionally. So alterations can be mood, that big a distinction, or it can be within a day. Like you may be holding it together and then the next thing you know, you're just crying your eyes out, and then the next moment you're screaming your head off because you're all over the place, because our emotions get dysregulated after trauma. So when I say alterations, I mean anything that seemed quote unquote normal for who you were before may change after the trauma, and especially in those first 30 days. Maybe you were a great sleeper and now you're only sleeping 2 hours a night. So alterations can occur in any area of life that had some kind of stability and now has a change due to the experience that came in between. Does that make sense?
Michele, if you don't mind, I want to just bring something up real quick, and you can discuss it now or we can do it later in session 2. But the question that keeps coming up for, or it did in our breakout session for all of us, was, you talked about that 30-day period, but for a NICU parent, I feel like all of us agreed it's a repeated trauma coming back into the NICU day after day, and watching our babies be resuscitated. There may be surgeries, major setbacks, fear of loss, and so kind of for us, I feel like almost that 30 days just keeps starting over. And there's just ongoing repeated trauma. So it's not just the birth of or a car wreck or a major event. It's this ongoing trauma. So I just wanted to bring that up in case that plays out into the discussion later. And one more thing, Kira did ask the difference between depression and PTSD. How do we know?
Okay, good question. So first of all, I am not a clinically licensed mental health professional, so I do not diagnose. So I'm not going to be offering you like, here's a clinical way of knowing the difference. What I would say to that is sit down with a licensed mental health professional and get them to discuss those differences with you. I think that's the best way for me to answer that, because I want to make sure that we guide everyone in the right direction. As a lay person, I think that PTSD is only diagnosed when you have symptoms in all of those 5 categories: re-experiencing, avoidance, hyperarousal, mood swings, and what's the fifth? They I'm blanking on the 5th one right now, and I don't want to go back to that slide, but I guess I could. But in that slide where it talks about the 5 different ways that can become dysregulated, it's those 5 categories. Depression is just one thing. So if you're depressed, a mental health professional will be able to isolate, okay, it's just depression. But if you have PTSD in these 5 categories of all these different symptoms, and that's the value of the PTSD self-test. We're not actually going to have time to go through it together now, but I am going to, at the end, give you a place where you can go to get this resource, and then you can sit down for yourself and go through these 22 questions. And this was enormously helpful in my process. The only way I actually ended up getting diagnosed with PTSD was I found this self-test, I took it, I answered positively to 20 of the 22 questions, and then I took that test to the therapist that I was working with, and I put it down on the desk and I said, do you think this is what's wrong? Because he hadn't mentioned PTSD at all, but I was definitely exhibiting all those symptoms. So, so that's what I would say to do, is to take this PTSD self-test, and that will start to give you a way to look at, okay, well, I'm not really answering positively to a lot of these questions. Maybe it's just depression. I hope that sort of covers it enough, because I want to stay within the scope of my practice in an appropriate way. Any follow-up question?
We had one question come in, and it may be one that we kind of expand on as well when we kind of talked about different opportunities in the future. But I know a lot of us here, are working with families in the NICU or post NICU. And we had a question that asks about vicarious trauma, and if you're going to be speaking on that at all.
Mm-hmm. Vicarious trauma is just as traumatizing from a clinical perspective as being on the front lines. For example, the death of a loved one, whether or not you're present at that death, is a precursor for PTSD. So vicarious trauma, we're taking it one more step removed, right? Because maybe you're supporting somebody. I'm not really sure how you all are defining vicarious trauma, so I'm just going to take a stab at it, because there's more than one way to define that. But if by vicarious you mean like you're a mom watching your baby in the NICU, I wouldn't call that vicarious trauma. I would call that your own, that is trauma. But if you're calling vicarious trauma like you're supporting somebody whose baby's in the NICU or going through a NICU trauma, so you're in the caregiver position, vicarious trauma is significant, and it has the same effects from my perspective as first frontline trauma. And so
absolutely, and I think that
I would say all of this applies.
I think that's where we're coming from as people who are supporting other NICU families, so being re-traumatized, but also the point was made that, in our NICU space, often you are very close to other families and other babies, and you are experiencing what they are going through as well. And so it's not just your own trauma, but you have made connections and you're seeing, and then you're also wondering, is that what's going to happen for your baby as well? Right. So I think there's some of that processing.
I think that's a really great point. And we're not even talking about the energy exchange yet, right? The energy of being in the NICU, the energy exchange of all these people bringing their collective traumatized energy into one small space, that whether you recognize, feel it, or notice it or not, your body is reading it. We are energetic beings. We are magnetic beings. We all have a force field, a magnetic force field that's 8 feet in diameter. So when you walk into a NICU space, you're walking into everybody else's magnetic field as well. And the dysregulation and the trauma in their field is definitely coming into your own. And you know, we don't talk about it that way very much, but we all know that feeling of walking into a space that feels heavy or dark, or, you know, however you want to define it. So Kelly, I think that's a great point. So, okay. Crystal, any other questions? Here we are. We're just sort of flipping things around and doing the Q&A here, because I think it's actually a good place for it once we all start having a chance to talk. So Crystal, have we missed anything? Is there anything outstanding?
I am looking through them now. I don't see many or anything that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay, all right. So then let's keep going as we move into what can you do today? Because that trauma happened yesterday. There's nothing you can do about it. We all know that. That's the hardest thing to accept. So I'm not even talking about accepting it. I'm just talking about where you are today. What can you do now? And healing starts with knowing, okay, what's possible for me? And in the healing space, you have 2 tracks. You have conventional modalities like talk therapy, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and other therapeutic approaches, DBT, all kinds of ways to approach healing trauma from a conventional therapeutic place, which I think is really important. I think every trauma starts with being able to tell your story, and being able to do that in a safe place, especially in a therapist setting, is enormously empowering and important. I do notice that trauma does not heal from talking about it. And here I would again just diverge for a second to mention the science. From a neurological perspective, every time you tell your story, you're activating the neural pathways of all of that pain and all of that trauma. I'm not in any position going to suggest when you stop doing that. I am just merely talking about the fact of the science, which is that healing is very hard to do when you keep activating and strengthening every time you activate the neural pathways of trauma. So it's very important at some point to start to learn, how do I stop telling my story and just get into the healing work? And sometimes you can do that with conventional modalities, and sometimes you need those alternative modalities. Now, those can, you know, there are a slew of things, from physical modalities like massage therapy and Reiki to energy psychology. I myself am a hypnotherapist and a neuro-linguistic programmer. So I do a lot with the unconscious and the neurological structures of the brain, tons of different ways to approach healing in a way that allows you to find your own path. So a lot of it's trial and error. And the main point that I would really want to express to all of you is to find the modalities that resonate with you. There is no should in trauma recovery. For example, I thought I should stay in talk therapy, which I did for 5.5 years until things were so bad that I completely collapsed. And after that, I realized I needed a different way to heal. And it took me on this whole other alternative path. And ultimately, I think it's the 2 paths together that are the strongest combination. So if you have questions about that, we won't have time to go into that today, but I'm happy to field questions as we go forward through the conference and beyond. So one thing that I would also recommend in terms of how you help yourself and others, some things to just be aware of and to think about, and be a compassionate listener so that you're listening to yourself and others, allowing that conversation to happen. And I'm just gonna move this, let's see, and get this out of the way, but I can't seem to close it. I don't want to disable something. So I'll tell you, it's all about connection. It's all about being able to listen, being able to hold the space for yourself and for others, to encourage connection, to offer love, and to create connection in love in the space of trauma. Because love, as you already know, is very healing, but I think that we don't always give it its due, because we're so wrapped up in the symptoms and the trauma, and whether it's learning to find ways to offer love to ourselves, just in some simple anti-anxiety hacks, for example, again, leaning on the science, but just hugging yourself changes the neurochemistry of your brain. So obviously hugging other people is great, but maybe sometimes you're alone and you don't have the opportunity to do that. If you just hug yourself for 2 minutes, you will completely change the neurophysiology of your entire makeup. And you can, in that way, just start to reground yourself and bring yourself back into a connected, more brain online kind of moment, which can be a really useful reset. And then also research and educate. I can't stress enough how important it is. The more you understand about trauma, and in some of the resources that I'm going to offer you at the end, the more you understand about trauma, the more quickly and effectively and efficiently you will find your way out of the trauma maze. Being without education is probably the number one thing that I see hold people back. And then lastly, there are two things every trauma survivor needs, and that's safety and control. Now, right off the bat, we can all say, well, the NICU doesn't offer either of those things. And a lot of the times, life after the NICU doesn't offer those things. And that would be true. And I would say, after we acknowledge that, let's step into the space beyond that and ask, how do I create safety and control in a space that lacks both safety and control? Because there are always ways to do that, even though on the surface, it may not look like those two things are possible. And sometimes safety is safety within yourself, right? It's finding that way to reconnect to your own self, or reconnect to the people that matter to you. And sometimes control is just control over your breathing, not necessarily the world at large. So I would offer, as a way to get started with safety and control, the opportunity to start looking for, how do I create a sense of safety just in my own body? How do I create a sense of control just in my own mind? And from there, you can start to build and see what other opportunities there are. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I am sensitive to the time. I know we started a little late, so I hope it's okay that we've gone a little bit over time. And I want to thank you all for listening and for caring, for putting into the chat those great questions. And I'm going to turn everything over to Kelly for a few moments to tell you what's coming up next.
Yes, thank you so much again, Michele. This was fantastic, and really brought up for me a lot of things that I have learned through the years, things that I know are important, things that as I get really busy, sometimes I forget. And I think for some of the people with us, they're newly NICU grads and haven't had time to process and all of those things. But one thing really stood out that you said today, and I really thought sharing my story was therapeutic, was healing. And I had been asked by an organization to share my story as part of fundraising and part of big campaign awareness. And I was so honored to be a part of that. And it was like ripping open a scar, like almost like close to healing, and then over and over and over again. And I knew nothing about trauma and PTSD and healing and all of these things. And so for me, I realize now that I really needed to do that hard work before I went out and was trying to help others and educate others. And so I think for a lot of people in this space today who are supporting other NICU parents, just a reminder that we need to go through this hard work and be in a safe space before we're able to truly help others. So that really, but there are so many amazing points today. So thank you for that. And we are so excited that you're going to be joining us. There will be a second session with Michele at our NICU community conference. This is a virtual conference. It is free. Is it November 3rd through the 5th? You can register online today at handtohold.org. There is a Spanish track. So if you are supporting Spanish speaking families in your NICUs, we want to make sure that they are aware and involved and invited to this conference. Again, it is free. It is virtual. You can pick as many or as few sessions as you would like to attend. And Michele will be leading a second session. And then there will be a third following the conference, again, for us to connect with Michele. So we hope all of you will join us for that. And Michele, we are, again, just so delighted that you were willing to do this kind of pre-conference and getting us ready to go into this dialogue. And I highly recommend your books if anyone wants to learn more and dive more into what we started today. I think many on this call today would agree that that was the first part of their healing was reading Michele's books. And then I saw some comments here that therapy is a combination, and I believe in that too. For some of us, it is medication before we're ready to do talk therapy. Maybe we need them in conjunction. Maybe we're not ready to jump right into EMDR, but we lead to that. And maybe it's more of the holistic healing approach. Everyone's healing process is very different. Finding the right therapist, finding the right support group in that healing space is so important. So any other questions or comments, Crystal, that we need to cover before we let everyone back to their very busy schedules today?
I don't see any. I think everyone's been great. Everyone's saying thank yous. Everyone's looking forward to November. So I'm really looking forward to, personally, the next two in Michele's series.
Thank you so much. This has been such a juicy conversation and so many different avenues. I feel like we could do a whole day just on trauma, all of us together. So I want to thank you, Crystal, for organizing this. Thank you, Kelly, for championing trauma and for allowing me to come into this space and share and help educate and create community around this really important topic. I am super excited for the conference and for my next presentation, which is all about how do we move forward. And I have a very, I love systems and processes. Emotional issues are chaotic. And so I like, let's make an organized approach to it. So I'm going to be sharing a 3-phase 9-step process for healing trauma. And once you have that, it sort of gives you a little bit more context, a little bit more anchor into, okay, how am I going to do this? Where am I? What's my next step? So I'm excited for that in November. And to close us out today, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for those questions. And I want to invite you to come into my world a little bit more deeply so that you can get more of the resources that will be really useful to you. Please feel free to hop onto mytraumacoach.com/trauma. There should be a dash there, trauma-informed. When you get there, you'll see that there are 3 resources. There is a trauma cheat sheet, which will give you an overview of some of the things we've talked about today that's really easy to share to help educate clients, family, or friends. There's also the PTSD self-test and also a neuroscience video that starts to explain how a thought creates a physical reaction so that what you went through 1 month ago or a decade ago actually creates the symptoms that you're feeling today. And when you understand that, you'll see this little space where you get to step in and reclaim control. So I invite any of you just to come to mytraumacoach.com/trauma-informed and continue this conversation. Again, if you have questions, feel free to email me. And if you would like the slides from today's presentation, just shoot me an email, michele@mytraumacoach.com. It's Michele with 1 L, as you can see here. And just put slides in the subject line and I'll send you a copy. So with that, Crystal, I'll hand everything back to you and thank you all so much. I'm really pleased to be on this journey with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you November 3rd through the 5th at our NICU Community Conference. And stay tuned to handlehold.org for lots more updates about webinars. We want to do this on a more regular basis. If you haven't already downloaded the Hand-to-Hold app, I would encourage you to do so from your app store. Just look for Hand-to-Hold in your app store and join our online community through our app. You can connect directly to our team of family support specialists for private appointments and our resource library for educational content, and get updates about webinars, and just connect with one another and share just like you're doing today through our online community. So welcome you into our online community through our app, and look forward to seeing you at our conference. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Crystal. Great job with all the tech, and we made it work. And y'all have a wonderful, blessed day. Thank you.